World leaders gather at the United Nations headquarters in New York for a major signing ceremony as the Paris Agreement on Climate moves forward. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Representatives from about 170 countries took part in a historic signing ceremony at the UN on Friday. A moment in history, said the Secretary General, who added, "We are in a race against time." China was one of the first countries to sign, with Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli attending as a special envoy on behalf of Chinese President Xi Jinping. The Vice Premier said that China would finalize legal procedures to ratify the Paris Agreement before the G20 summit, which takes place in China in September. And he also stressed China's commitment to achieving its climate goals.
We will take effective actions at home to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. China has set the target of achieving the peaking of carbon dioxide emissions around 2030 and making best efforts to peak early. And relevant actions have been incorporated into our national development plans.
Well, joining me now from New York, where he's been covering the event at UN headquarters, is CCTV correspondent Nathan King. And Nathan, how historic and significant was the signing ceremony?
Quite historic, considering where we've come from, Anand. Remember back in 2009, the Copenhagen Climate Summit, which ended in division and rancor, not least between the US and China, basically the developed and the developing world, pointing fingers about the past and also the way forward. And now we are seeing a coming together of 175 countries. In fact, the US and China really leading the way with their agreement for China to cap emissions by 2030 and the US at the same time to bring them down before the Paris summit. And that really helped ink the deal. Remember, both of them are accounting for 40% of global emissions just between them. So that was a historic deal which laid the path to towards where we are today. But remember, this is historic in that all these countries, 175 now, have agreed that they want to cap global temperature growth to 2 degrees centigrade or below, ideally 1.5, and raise $100 billion a year by the year 2020 to help developing countries mitigate the effects of climate change that's already happened and pave the way for renewable energy as well. So everyone being on the same page really does help. Now, of course, it isn't over yet, but the fact that we've come out of Paris and that we have this signing ceremony and so many have joined on, it won't, by the way, become official until 55 countries or 55% of emissions are accounted for, but we are on the road.
Nathan, now comes the hard part, implementation. What about implementation, and what do you see as some of the stumbling blocks ahead?
Right, well, there's a difference between agreeing and signing and joining. And we've had the agreeing in Paris, we've had the signing here, but the joining means ratification, a lot of times through domestic parliaments that are divided, not least here in the United States, for example, where it's actually a Paris Agreement, largely because it couldn't be a treaty, because then it would have had to go through the US Senate for ratification. So this is an executive action here in the US. A change of presidency, and there are already legal challenges as well, could actually make the US commitments unimplementable. And it's not just the US. India has a big problem with its national parliament. As you know, big cities in India are among the world's most polluted. The Ganges is the most polluted river in the world. And European countries also having a big problem necessarily getting it through their parliament. And then, of course, there's the trust issue. If some countries start to pull back, why don't other countries? So it really is a very, very difficult thing to get everyone on the same page. The one uniting thing, though, is that climate change does not happen in a vacuum. If the world's temperatures go up, it affects everyone on the planet, so everyone has to act.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting from New York. And now for more, joining me from Beijing is Changhua Wu. She is chair of the China Redesign Hub and was previously the Greater China Director of the Climate Group. Also with us from California is Chris Field. He is a professor of environmental studies at Stanford University. Joining us from New York is Renato Redento-Constantino. He is the Executive Director at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, and he is also a board member of the Philippine People's Survival Fund. And with me here in the studio is Tara Huska. She is U.S. Director for an environmental activist organization called Honor the Earth, and she's also a special advisor to U.S. presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. Welcome to all of you to the show. Wu, let me start with you. We just heard the Chinese Vice Premier there tell us a moment ago that China will finalize legal procedures, sort of ratify these agreements that have been made before the G20 summit, which will take place in China in September. What impact is this going to have on China?
China is very serious about its commitment, as the Vice Premier said in New York, and China has started taking actions domestically. It's already fully reflected in the 13th Five-Year Plan, which was just adopted actually last month in Beijing. In it, China's commitment to the Paris Agreement, including the capping around its emissions around 2030, including energy intensity target, the carbon intensity target, and also aggressive targets around development of renewable energy sectors. So in China, it's pretty much sort of already built into the domestic process in order to get ready to deliver its goal and commitment to the international process. So China is absolutely serious about it. In the meantime, actually, China also recognizes its role in the international or global governance around the global challenges like climate change. And so besides its own domestic efforts, China is also playing a more active role in the international community, particularly forming strong partnership with the U.S., in the meantime trying to bring all the others together. So the commitment actually to the international community before G20, China said we're going to adopt that parliament for legally actually in China, and China will definitely be there and honor its commitment, having it integrated into domestic legislative framework before September.
Chris, the United States is hoping to join formally the agreement later this year. When that happens, what are the implications for the United States? And, you know, what kind of obligations does this put on the United States?
A really interesting feature of the commitments that the U.S. made for the Paris Agreement, 26 to 28% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, is that most of the pieces for that are already embedded in executive actions that have already occurred, whether they're for energy efficiency or the Clean Power Plan or for other steps that have already been taken or woven increasingly into the fabric of the U.S. energy profile. But as you know, many aspects of the U.S. energy future are still unclear, including legal challenges to the Clean Power Plan. As those things work through the court, we'll see how difficult or straightforward it'll be for the U.S. to comply. What we can say at this point is that the U.S. is on track, and the extension of the tax credits for renewables plays an important role in the U.S. ability to keep up with the early stages of the components of the Paris pledges.
Renato, the broad goals of the deal is to cut emissions and to restrict the rise in global temperatures to 2%, hopefully 1.5%. Is that going to be enough?
First of all, the deal for vulnerable countries is about a temperature goal that is not well below 2 degrees. It's not about 1.9 or 1.8 or 1.7. For vulnerable countries like the Philippines and a lot of others, it's about 1.5, which is not a mere aspirational goal. It is a matter of survival. And 1.5 is going to be the yardstick by which we can say whether implementation of the Paris Agreement has been successful or not. It spells a difference between far more suffering, needless suffering, and the loss of lives and livelihood, or a chance to stabilize our future and eventually help developing countries to reach their sustainable development goals.
Right, there has been talk, Renato, about what would happen if that goal is not achieved, because you would have island nations which could go underwater. You'd have serious problems with food production around the world. Do you think that developed countries around the world are aware of these problems, aware of the urgency with which they must be tackled?
The awareness level is growing. It's not growing fast enough, but it is growing. People's movements are making their voices increasingly heard. and governments are taking notice now more than ever before. The impacts are undeniable. If you look at the examples of extreme weather events in the United States or in the Philippines or in Fiji, these are taking place with just a 1-degree temperature rise relative to pre-industrial levels, just 1 degree. Imagine what would happen if we breach the 2-degree level, if we go above 1.5. The issues about hunger, about health, about the massive impacts, the hits that economies will take, hitting the poorest hardest. These are undeniable, and I am hopeful that movements around the world, from the United States and Europe to Asian and African and Latin American countries, will make their voices heard, and governments will continue to do the right thing. Today has been a really, really important day. It's a morale booster because you have 175 countries, the largest ever in history, to come together in one day to sign an international agreement. That gives us hope, but also it reminds us of sobering realities, that decisions that were taken in December in Paris and today should have been made a decade ago. We have very little time and we need to act urgently.
Tara, as we heard there from NATO, today is an important day. We also heard from our reporter telling us how historic and significant this signing ceremony is. I want you to take a listen to what the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry had to say at the signing ceremony. Let's watch.
Indeed, even in the time since we convened in Paris, we have seen new evidence of the danger that the climate change pace poses to our planet. We learned that 2015 was the hottest year in recorded history by far. And we learned that after knowing that the past decade was the hottest on record.
Do you sense that there is urgency now in the United States on getting on board?
I think that we've finally reached the point where we're at least talking about it. We still do have a Congress that has members that believe climate change is not, they're climate change deniers. But I think with this presidential election, we've actually seen climate become a very central piece of what the Democrats are arguing about, right? I mean, it's something that's included now in almost every single debate. The U.S. is aware and understands that we have communities in Alaska that are going underwater. We have communities in Louisiana that are actually having to recede and go back. Climate change is something that's happening right now, and the actions that we take are directly impacting our futures. And so I think the American public has become very aware of it, and it's something that our lawmakers in turn are now becoming, more vocal about.
When you say it's part of the election debate, has it got beyond political point scoring into the realm of actually we need to do something about this? We need to actually formulate detailed policies on it?
I mean, there are definitely members of Congress that have introduced legislation that is absolutely geared towards that. There's very comprehensive pieces of legislation that are sitting there. Unfortunately, it does remain a very political issue. And, I haven't really seen a whole lot of movement on things that we really should be addressing. I mean, the Climate Change Accord is something, or the Paris Accord is, a really great model document, but it's something that we actually need to do. Just talking about it, that's great that we've taken that step, but we actually need to do something about it. Right. And I'm hopeful that we can push our legislators to actually take those steps and represent the people.
Wu, China and the United States account for something like 40% of global emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, this deal comes at a time, and China's been pushing very hard for it, but at the same time, we have the Chinese economy that is slowing down. Can China grow its economy and at the same time meet these obligations under this deal? I mean, how big a challenge will that be for China?
The current economic slowdown, which is sort of fortunate, but from the carbon emissions side, actually, it's a plus. It's plus in a way that China does not need to grow that as much as before, and we are not growing at the double-digit number anymore. And so when you do not need that much, actually, you do not consume as much fossil fuel as before. So that's a bigger context, which is sort of unfortunate, but also become the driver for change, for transformation. So what's happening now, basically, everyone trying to figure out how to build up or develop a new economic growth engines or drivers, particularly around the clean technologies, renewable energy, electric vehicles, and you name it, actually. And hopefully through that process, through the technology innovation, through the policy incentives, we'll be able to build up a brand new economy. And in that process, we can pretty much deliver the decoupling of economic growth and energy, particularly fossil fuel energy consumption there. China's record has already demonstrated the decoupling is already a trend. And now with the technology progress, with the cost of technologies actually dropping down very fast, and now we have a better chance to build up a new clean economy without really emitting as much as greenhouse gases before. So there is a hope today. In the meantime, actually, China is also furthering opening up and joining hands with the international community, particularly the United States, with the two largest economies in the world determined to transform their economy, shifting the development paradigm. You can pretty much sure the world economy is shifting towards a low-carbon future. So that's where the hope is.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More on the major climate signing ceremony at the United Nations when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the historic signing ceremony at the United Nations today. Leaders and representatives from around the world gathered to sign on to the Paris Agreement that was hammered out in France last year. Let's get back to our panel. And Chris, as I mentioned, the United States is the other major producer of greenhouse gases. We know that President Obama is on board. He's a strong advocate of measures to reduce these emissions. But how much opposition does he face domestically? Tara mentioned just now the opposition that's coming from Congress. Then, of course, there was the decision at the U.S. Supreme Court to shelve temporarily the Clean Power Act that the president wanted. How big a challenge is this going to be for the U.S. to live up to its commitments?
The landscape in the U.S. is very, very diverse. We see incredibly rapid growth in the deployment of renewables. Solar energy has grown something like 50-fold from 2006 to 2015. Wind energy grew more than 7-fold over that period. More than 175,000 jobs in America now in the solar energy industry. We're seeing amazing progress there, and we're seeing lots of particular regions, California and the Northeast, where there's already ambitious embrace of the steps that are necessary to move to a low-carbon future. But as you say, the landscape in the U.S. is very diverse. We'll see what happens with upcoming court decisions about the Clean Power Plan, but we also need to see how much the private sector steps up to fill the clear and growing need for the technologies that can drive emissions of greenhouse gases lower and lower and eventually to zero.
Renata, the other big question, of course, is money. Developing countries are going to need help to make this transition to a greener economy, to better energy sources. Some developing countries say it may be better off holding off on signing this agreement until they can get the richer countries to pay in more so that they can make an easier transition to cleaner energy. Is that a good strategy?
I think it's not a good strategy. I think it's an absurd strategy. The sooner that countries not only sign but join the agreement as well by ratifying it and seeing an early entry into force of the Paris Agreement is to the best interests of vulnerable countries, not just developing countries, but vulnerable countries. The amount of work that is required to transform the economies in the developing world is massive, and waiting is simply not an option. When we talk about resources and finance, oftentimes, especially in the past, it has been a subject of rancorous argument and debate. While differences still are prevalent in many pieces of negotiations of items that we still need to negotiate, the fact is the vulnerable countries have stepped up to challenge not only the developed world, but the large developing countries as well, by saying that For instance, for the Climate Vulnerable Forum and the V20 group of finance ministers of vulnerable countries, they set a target of raising $20 billion by 2020 on their own. And this target is a target that they set for themselves. They're, of course, calling out for partners in the developed and developing world to help them raise this money. They've been using their budgets as well, because waiting is simply not a strategy that is wise. Even though domestic money is not going to be enough to transform their economies and to adapt to climate change, the need to share and support one another is very evident. China has played a very positive role in terms of extending support for the need of vulnerable countries to embark on more sustainable pathways. Vietnam has contributed a sizable amount to the Green Climate Fund. The biggest potential, actually, in terms of raising finance and supporting one another is among developing countries. And the challenge is great, but the signs are looking really good.
Tara, when you look at this agreement, there are some nuances in it, some changes in it, which don't seem to make sense. You had the Kyoto Agreement, which made, well, countries, the rich countries, were legally responsible to help poor countries. But this agreement, they're not legally responsible anymore. It's just voluntary. Isn't that a step backwards?
I think that it's interesting to me that people really hailed this as this amazing document. I think there were a lot of flaws in this agreement. There really were, and I mean, we have heard about the implementation of this, right? I mean, really, how binding is this? I think it's historic in the sense that all these countries got together and talked about climate change and came to an agreement and an understanding all mutually together. I think that was historic. I think it was wonderful. However, there are all of these actual pieces that are not legally binding, that are not going to be actually put in place unless they agree to it. From our perspective, from the indigenous communities, an example of that would be the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's something where it's great that you guys make that document. It's not legally binding on the United States. They said, okay, yeah, well, we're cool with this, but we're not actually going to give you the rights that are provided for in this document. Mm-hmm. So, I want to see more.
Right. Wu, what is your view on that? Are there flaws in this agreement, something that would perhaps, let countries get away with just saying, okay, we acknowledge this document, we acknowledge this agreement, we'll sign it, but really, we're not obliged to do anything about it?
Well, I think I agree with what Tara just said. This is a wonderful piece of agreement, and it's pretty much reflecting the plateau of the international community's willingness, recognition of the global challenge of climate change, also recognizing the joint efforts as the must to have in order to address global challenges like climate change issues there. Is it enough? And we all know it's not, but it is a good foundation that already sets the long-term targets, the goal, where the world is going before, leading up to end of the century. We have to address these issues. We have to address the emissions, carbon emissions issues there. But in the meantime, actually, I think it's a struggle. The Paris negotiation process reflects some sort of dilemma that we've been witnessing over the last 2 decades, in particular around the climate change negotiation, basically saying, where do you draw the line? Should that be legally binding or bottom up? I think a Paris Agreement happens to be sort of a joined up of the two ends. So to a certain extent, it is a international legal framework. That's going to be to a certain extent legally binding. But in the meantime, we all recognize actually that's not enough. We need to make sure countries are willing to put commitments on the table, that hopefully they're going to be able to honor their commitments on the table. So if you look at the Paris Agreement, there are mechanisms set up already. Make sure, on a regular basis, every 5 years, we're going to review, start taking, and also hopefully through that process to lift up the level of ambitions. But in the meantime, of course, the weakness is, say, what if? What if a country fails actually to deliver, to honor its commitment? What would be the penalties? That part probably remain to be vague. I think it's a struggle, but it's a good balance, the best probably result we could have today.
Chris, when we look at broad political sentiment in the United States, and something that has come up in the debate, is what happens? I mean, we are in the middle of an election campaign right now. What happens if the United States elects a president who is a climate change skeptic?
You know, where I think we are now is at the point where low carbon technologies are attractive on their own. We've already reached the point where in most cases natural gas is cheaper than coal, and over the last several years natural gas has been squeezing coal out of the electricity market. We're increasingly seeing an environment where wind is increasingly cheaper than natural gas, and wind is beginning to compete effectively with natural gas. We have a complicated political landscape in the U.S., but I think what we really have in the U.S. is a tremendous commitment to free markets and to innovation, and I hope that whoever is president, there's going to be a recognition that renewable energies, clean energies, are going to provide a compelling set of opportunities for the future. And more than anything else, I see the Paris Agreement as an indication that all countries of the world agree that we have significant challenges with climate, and those agreements create what the private sector has been calling for, predictability in the space going forward. And I think that's going to be as important as government action. We need government action for sure, but we also need that predictability to unleash the market forces.
All right, Renato, very quickly, we've just got a few seconds left. Is it perhaps asking a bit too much to ask these countries to legally sign on to a document, given, as Chris has pointed out, that countries have their own domestic political considerations to take account of?
It is not politically too much. It is necessary for countries to ratify the agreement, but also for the citizens of these countries to put their government's feet to the fire. We can all say all we want that the Paris Agreement is not binding and has no teeth. Then it's up to the people to show their teeth, because it's popular movements who actually make the agreement work.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.